Welcome to a very special Samso Insight. We're here in Melbourne, in South Yarra. We are talking the discovery of Argyle with the father of Argyle Diamond Mines. I know he's a bit modest, but you know the tag is there. Ewen Tyler is the man largely responsible for driving the team, and then we all know it's a team event for the discovery. So I'm here talking to Ewen. Finally, Ewen, welcome to Samso.
Thank you.
Thank you for allowing us into your home to talk about the discovery of Argyle. So Ewen, stage is yours.
Well, I suppose it has to start with my childhood, really.
Yeah, look.
My childhood in Sarawak, which was when I discovered my first diamond. I was learning to use a dulang, one of those, like a Chinaman's hat, wooden pan. My father was looking for cinnabar out at a place called Tigora and Gadding, up country and out of Kuching. And I was padding with this dulang, and the Chinese chap who owned the mineral claims that Dad was evaluating said, "Tuan Kichi, that is a diamond." And it was as big as my little finger, so it must have been a carat or two. And of course I thought I was going to get a diamond, but he put it in his pocket, not being a silly fella. But that was my first involvement. Then I went, after I'd completed work at the University of WA, I went to East Africa, to a mine where my father had been 20 years previously. And it was a gold mine, but it was very close to Williamson's diamond mine at Madui in Tanganyika. And so I got a lot of contact with people from Madui. They would come and drink in our club, and I would talking to their exploration people and discovered all about diamond indicator minerals and all that sort of stuff about how you run a diamond exploration program. So I kept all this sort of information in my head. Then I went to London after Africa. I had 10 years in Africa, bred 3 children in Africa, in Gaita, all in the same room, I might say, in the mine hospital. And I was going to go to Canada, because Canada was, at that stage, was an important place for, is that me?
No, that's me.
Important place for geologists. And I got to London, and there were still a few unfinished pieces of business to do at Gaita. And so I went there ostensibly only for a year. But the boss there, Michael Easby, said, I think you should probably just buy a house here because it'll be a good investment. We'll back you into it, and if you stay longer, you'll be able to sell it, and you'll probably make $1 or $2, pound or two out of it. So we did that. I up-sticked my family from Gaita, took them to London, and of course, at that point in time, things went very wrong in the Congo Belge, as they called it in those days, because our money, the Tanganyika concessions money, all came from mining copper in the Katanga. So there was a real question mark now. Mobutu had taken charge of the Congo, and Katanga, there was a war going on in the Katanga. The Katangese that actually ran the copper mines didn't like Mobutu, and so there was a big brouhaha. But fortunately, there was a huge copper stockpile, probably $50 million in those days, sitting outside the Congo. And so the directors of Union Miniere du Haut-Katanga, which was the company running the Katanga copper deposits, they decided that they would try and reduce their exposure to doing things in Mobutu's Congo, and they decided that they would do something in Canada, and they would do something in Australia. And because I was an Australian in the London office of Tanganyika, I was the wild Australian boy, they called me. I led an expedition out to Australia to go and have a look and see what possibilities there might have been for their money, a lot of money that they had in those days. I mean, $50 million was a lot of dough. And so I took them, introduced them to all the mining companies, and also to all the government mines ministers and so forth. And I can remember going to Perth, where my father-in-law had been a deputy premier, and meeting Charles Court, and he came to try and sell us iron ore, to sell Union Miniere iron ore in WA. And the Belgians said, "Oh, we've got plenty of iron ore in Belgium. We're not interested in that." Big mistake. Anyway, that was my first introduction coming back to Australia, was bringing Union Miniere here. After that trip, they decided to set up Union Miniere Australia Limited as a holding company, and Union Miniere Mining and Exploration Company as an exploration company. And the contrary to all my expectations, because this was about the time of the Poseidon activity, they decided that they would become involved in metal search, or nickel search, really. I mean, not doing any of their traditional metals at all. And that struck me as a bit odd, but nevertheless, that was what they wanted to do. And they appointed Ken Lassen, who was was a professor of geology at Sydney University. They asked him and his private company whether they would be their managers of Union Miniere Exploration Limited in Australia. And Ken and I were old friends from Captain's Flat days, because he used to be my father's geologist at Captain's Flat, just straight after the war. They'd both been in the war together, and they both were members of the Captain's Flat RSL, so they were pretty close buddies. So that was how they got themselves established and ran exploration here. Well, I was back in London after that, and then it was a case of who is keeping an eye on what is going on in Australia? How do we know what the Union Miniere people are up to? Although Ken is your best friend, we think we should send you to Australia to go and have a look. And so I made a trip with my wife and children by sea at their expense, and I went over to have a look and see what was going on in Melbourne. And I was a little bit concerned that the way they'd got their structure organised, not that I was complaining at all about what Ken was doing with the exploration in the field part, but what was happening, because the chap who was the chairman was a playboy. He was a delightful man, Serge Fontenas, but he was really a playboy, and he had all his girlfriends around him.
So how old were you at this point in time?
Pardon?
How old were you at this point
I would be 40.
In your 40s?
In my 40s, yes.
So that, I asked that question because obviously this is where that Argyle story, the way you manage everything, is
it's got to
start from, right?
So, the Argyle story is about to start
Yeah.
when I'm on my 45th birthday was when we found M109. But it's important to set the stage, because I was in London, we had started to invest money in Australia, and somebody had to go and keep an eye on what was going on. So I went, after Union Miniere was established, I went and established a branch of Tanganyika Holdings in Melbourne, and I was given a series of funds that I could use, very modest, $20,000 funds, that I could have a go at different things. And I bought into Cooper's Creek exploration and mining, platinum, didn't do any good, Wingelina, nickel in West Australia, didn't do any good. And they were getting pretty fed up with my dud investments. But I did do one $20,000 into a thing called the Columbaroo Joint Venture. And the Columbaroo Joint Venture consisted of 5 people or 5 companies that were silly enough to put $20,000 together so we would make the Columbaroo Joint Venture. And it was the Columbaroo Joint Venture under the guidance of my manager in West Australia, Mick Poltridge, and under his geologist, Smith, who designed the program to sample 196,000 square kilometres in the Kimberley, because I was attracted to the Kimberleys because of Rex Pryder, my professor at the UWA. So we set up this program. We did 196,000 square kilometres of sampling, small samples, only 12 kilo gravel samples, carefully sieved, very carefully collected, right over that area. Discovered sampling by helicopter. We could do it economically, and we didn't allow the helicopter pilot to do panning in the creeks there. I insisted, this was my contribution, that if we were going to use a helicopter, we were going to use a geologist. He would collect or she would collect the sample, they would screen off the oversize, and they would bring a properly collected sample back to our laboratory where it would be processed, and then we would look at it microscopically to see whether there was anything in it. And on the evening, and we got, I think, 1,200 or 1,800 samples, I think we collected. And so, when we were starting to look at all these concentrates, Maureen Muggeridge, who Mick Poltridge found in a pub in West Perth, she was a geologist. She knew something about microscopy. Rob Mosig came in from Northern Mining on secondment, and they were sitting there on the evening of my 45th birthday, the 23rd of August, 1973, when Maureen, or when Chris, when Mick asked, or Mick Poltridge, no, not Mick Poltridge, when Rob Mosig asked Chris Smith to have a look down his microscope, because he thought that this was a zircon in the middle of his field, a big, perhaps a kimberlitic zircon. And Chris looked down the microscope and said, yes, it is a zircon, but more importantly, in the top right-hand corner of your screen, of your field, there's a diamond. And he then looked further through the concentrate, and he found there was pyrope garnet, there was chrome diopside, there was picroilmenite, chromite, and diamonds. And it was, as I say, that was the absolute changing moment, because we now knew that in this one sample collected by Maureen, M109, up a creek we named Taropas Creek, had certainly somewhere in that drainage there was a rock producing diamonds, and it couldn't be too far away because the chrome diopside was still there and it doesn't travel very far. So now there we go.
So before you carry on, because I think I want to stop you there, because that's like the summary of the journey to
that's
discovery.
The starting of the journey.
Because the M109 was a critical sample, critical period of the whole journey.
That was it.
But going back to your mention of Rex Pryder and things, because it was Rex who had this concept. I want to explore that part. So it was Rex Pryder who had this concept that there was this potentially this different type of rocks that could be very different from the kimberlitic stuff we get from South Africa. And they could produce diamonds. And I think you mentioned briefly that was he had this concept, but I want to explore that because I think that could carry a lot of weight in your thinking and your eagerness.
It surely did.
Yeah.
Because it was Rex telling me as a student that when he was a student with these rocks collected by Wade in the West Kimberleys, these lucite lamproites that Rex did his PhD at Cambridge in the 1930s, and these were, he said, they were consanguineous with the kimberlites in South Africa bearing diamonds. And it was that, you're quite right, Noel, it was that message that Rex put into my mind that years later, after Africa and London, made me think, if we're going to start looking for diamonds in Australia, where would we go to look? And of course it would be obviously as far as I would, because somewhere near Rex's point, and that's how we picked that area of the Kimberleys. Chris Smith designed the program. We collected the samples. We found M109, and of course we found indicator minerals elsewhere in that sampling program. But it was the M109, and of course it was in an Aboriginal reserve, was where it came from, and that allowed or made it necessary for me to do a lot of negotiating with the Aborigine people at Umbulgurri, because what became a very good friend of mine, Robert Roberts, had tried to take all his people out of Wyndham, where they were drinking themselves to death, and establish themselves in Umbulgurri, their traditional home. He grew up in what used to be called the Forest River Mission. And that's really how I got money to continue the search, because that was a diamond discovery. London and all the other 4 participants in my $20,000 diamond search each was sufficient to get them to kick in and kick on. And it was that initial moment that started us to go right round the Kimberleys, sampling, examining areas, and we lighted upon the northern part of the Kimberleys near Columbaroo, which is why we called it the Columbaroo Joint Venture. And we built a big diamond plant, we built a diamond recovery plant, and we were going to sample all the northern drainages, everything that was draining to the north, and see whether we could find any diamonds, because we could find chrome dioxide almost indiscriminately, but nowhere else except one other place in the West Kimberley on Mount North Creek. And that wasn't for some while, because we continued to go around in the northern part and discovered, as a result of our searching, Skerring, which was a kimberlite dike, didn't have enough diamonds in it. Like Turopus, we also found the pipe there, didn't have enough diamonds in it. But we were starting to run out, well, my London people and my others were running out of patience. We'd spent $1.6 million on, they would have described as a futile search, when we asked Rio Tinto, or Rhys Towie, got involved with John Collier of CRA, as it was in those days. And John Collier was attracted to what Rhys was telling him, and so we created the Ashton Joint Venture. And it was the Ashton Joint Venture that started the search right through the Kimberleys, looking at everything that the Columbaroo Joint Venture had found.
So this is the point where CRA came
This is the point where CRA comes in. They came in to spend 1.6 million. We'd spent 1.6 million up to that point. When we'd spent 1.6 million, they would that was their introduction to obtain. Initially, we thought it was going to be a 35% interest, but it sort of crept up to 45 through various jiggling around with the other holdings. And it was Frank Hughes that looked at one of the samples that had produced a piece of pyrope garnet in the West Kimberley that he thought, and was critical of me because we hadn't followed that up. And he went and followed that up Mount North Creek, and as he went up Mount North Creek, there he found a big depression. He could see a diamond on the ground there. He couldn't believe it, but it was there. And he looked up and around, and there was a claim from Mount Isa Mines on this part of this body, which became Ellendale number 4. But so we had to wait until that claim had expired. That's my point. Okay. And so it was on the Easter Day, 1974. I think maybe I'm getting my dates out, but it was on an Easter morning that the claim expired. We went in and pegged Ellendale number 4. We ran an airborne geophysics, and this is all very secret. We had no title to anything. We went and sampled, or flew an airborne geophysics magnetometry, and identified, I think, 46 other magnetic anomalies over and above the lucite lamprite that stuck up. And there was this other rock which didn't have any outcrop, which was of course, they were what we ultimately called olivine lamprites, but I to this day continue to call them kimberlites, because to me and my generation, a rock containing a diamond was a kimberlite.
So this was the discovery of Ellendale.
This is the Ellendale. This was most exciting, and we went, pegged and found another one next door to it, equally significant, Ellendale number 9, which actually produced the fancy yellow diamonds, and we sampled, as I say, bulk sampled about 46 of these pipes. We set up a plant there. We thought we were home and hosed, but there was not enough revenue per ton of rock to justify digging up these Ellendale pipes, or so we thought. But in August of 1969, the news came to me from the laboratory that they had found some diamonds in Smoke Creek. And he came in one morning where there were 2 diamonds. Next day, I think there were 4. The day after that, 6 diamonds. So there was obviously something very exciting going on up in Smoke Creek. But
this is to the east of the Kimberley, right?
This is in the northeast of the Kimberley,
as opposed to Ellendale,
the south side of Lake Argyle.
Yeah. So before you go, I think we've got to give context to
We're now
190,000 square kilometres of land.
Right.
So if people watching this are thinking, well, that's a lot of land. So you don't have tenure on any of this land, and that's how it was done. You just went somewhere, collected, walked away, and I think before we go to the juicy part, because one of the things, and before we go on, I guess a lot of this information I've gathered from the book here called Argyle, The Impossible Story of Australian Diamonds by Stuart Kells, which is sort of based around your memoirs, I think.
Entirely, yeah.
And one of the things is all the things that you've described, the team, everything, and the waiting, and you know, that what we're touching on, the 190,000 plus square kilometres, where you really didn't want to say anything. You just went in and then did your thing and walked away. First of all, how did you collect the team? Second of all, the team must have been so working together that you were able to work as one, not to be, you know, loose lips sink ships. You know that saying? How did that was kept together?
Well, it was a big issue, and you're quite right now, because we started off. Tanganyika was me. There was AO Australia, which was Alan Jones, which was ultimately became part of Malaysia Mining Corporation. There was Sibeka, which was part of Union Miniere, because of my Tanganyika association. There was Jennings Mining, because Sir Alfred Jennings wanted to be into the world of exploration, and we'd done some work exploring for copper in the Kimberleys beforehand. And then there was Northern Mining and Rhys Towie, and because, as I say, I'd been in school with Rhys. He was a year or 2 older than me. So that was the team that we started with, and that was the team we very nearly finished with. We had our ups and downs, because Rhys, as soon as we found M109, he wanted to broadcast that to the world. You know, he was in the business of raising money for Northern Mining shareholders, and of course we had to sit on him, and he didn't like that. But so we had to agree to have the Northern Mining Funding Agreement. The Northern Mining Funding Agreement said that the rest of us would contribute his contribution, you know. And because we all had a 20% interest, you know, that was something we took on to do for a period.
Just to keep him quiet.
Just to keep him, it was just...
Well, help him keep quiet.
Well, it did. Yeah. It wasn't terribly successful, because it used to leak periodically through the Australian press, who knew there was something going on. And of course that brings me to another thing that I haven't mentioned, and that is our arrangement with the West Australian government. Because my colleagues in London and in Brussels were saying, well, this is ridiculous. You can't go on spending all this money and you haven't got any title. I mean, what is this all about? Well, it so happens that the first person, other than the 5 joint venturers, that I told about M109 was Charles Court, when he was leader of the opposition in West Australia.
Sir Charles Court.
Sir Charles, he became Sir Charles later. Yes, but I said to him, I made this discovery. It's a new thing in West Australia. I mean, I'm very excited by it. And he said, and I said, well, should I tell the government? Now, I because my father-in-law and Charles Court had worked together. My father-in-law led the Country Party, Charles led the Liberal Party, but they'd been together in Parliament, more or less in a coalition. So I went to see Charles and tell him and said, what do I do? I've no title. What do I do? And he said, well, he said, Vampin G. And I said, well, what on earth do you mean by Vampin G? Well, he said, I don't think you should tell the government anything, but Vampin G, which is what you do, what the orchestra does when they're waiting for the fat lady to come on the stage. And he said, I'll probably be made Premier at the election next February, so just keep quiet. Don't tell the government when I'm in power, come back and we'll see what we can do, which is exactly what we did. When Charles became Premier, we made a delegation to go and see him, Alan Jones and I actually, and he said, well, I think you'll have to see the Minister for Mines, go and talk to Arthur Mensaros anyway, and see what he can do. And between them, they came up with an idea that we would advise the West Australian government where we were particularly interested in searching for diamonds, and he would instruct the chief geologist to have a map on which we would tell him where our areas of interest were, and he would keep it locked up safe in his safe, the chief geologist, I've forgotten his name now, it'll come in a minute, and he would undertake not to grant temporary reserves in any of those areas that we have selected. He couldn't stop people paying mineral claims, but we would not let people have temporary reserve to block out big areas of land in WA. So that was the best deal we could do. So that was our security. That encouraged the 5 members of the Columbaroo joint venture to continue searching. And then, of course, CRA came in because I was not able to raise any more wind. We had all sorts of problems. We got Mr. RTX O'Connor, the Minister for Mines, who was making it very difficult to bring money in from overseas for exploration, and all that nonsense.
Would that be critical? Do you think that was
but that was a very critical point, and it just so happened that Rhys Towie had been talking to John Collier of CRA, suggesting there was something we could do. Perhaps they might join us. But my team, the others of us who had interest in bringing money from overseas, it was not going to be so easy whilst Mr. Connor and the Labour government was in power. But on the day that the Whitlam government fell in October 1975, something like that, November the 11th was the day that we knew that Reginald Francis Xavier Connor had gone, Malcolm Fraser had formed the government, and we decided that it would be prudent now for us to join forces with a foreign company. CRA was a London company, effectively, and inject a large sum of money to continue our exploration. And that was the exploration. The day, more or less before the ink was dried, we had found the first kimberlite pipe, Skerring, which was discovered just more or less that time we signed them up. And they couldn't really believe their luck. And then we were doing some work in the King George River, processing the alluvials there to see sources of diamonds. And Maury Morby, the chairman, Russ Madigan, and Warren Atkinson, they were all up watching while we were doing some jigging in the King George River. And there, lo and behold, as John Collier was jigging with a pan, there was a diamond out of the King George River. So Russ, to the day he died, believed that Big Portridge had put it there, but it was absolutely dinkum. We collected a lot of diamonds out of Morelli's Fox, as we called it, in the King George River. But I got a bit out of my sequence, but that was the introduction of CRA. They came in, they opened up Ellendale. Ellendale was looking no good. In August 1969, the news came from the lab about the diamonds in Smoke Creek. There was unfortunately a temporary reserve owned by some German people whose name I've forgotten, Uhrenerz, very near where Smoke Creek was. So we didn't move into Peg, Argyle, or the Argyle area, until the October of 1969, 1979.
So how was that period when were that close to the Holy Grail, what you felt maybe had been the Holy Grail, but you had to sit and wait
all the time. At Ellendale,
is this very common?
At Ellendale, we had to wait for Mount Isa to go, and at Argyle, we had to wait for Uhrenerz to go before we could take title.
And this is where I said, the secrecy and everything was so
tight.
So,
And you can be so easily betrayed if somebody, as we always had in our Columbaroo joint venture, we always had one that was a little less well funded than the rest of us. Probably my mistake originally, to having a place that relied on the market rather than the rest of us, which all had more respectable sources of income. I mean, there's Jennings had a big housing business behind it. There was Sibeka was a diamond company. Tanganyika had pots of money. AO Australia had all the tin fields of Malaysia in his pocket. And we had this one weakling because he was a school friend of mine. Well, not really. He was a bit in front of me at school,
yeah.
but who had no money. He was there because I was a director of Northern Mining, because I'd invested Tanganyika money in this on the basis of the Weld Range, not the Weld Range, of the Mount Weld? No. Anyway, so Arnor deposits at the back of Geraldton, and Reese was doing some good work there, and I thought that this might be an alternative to the resources of the Pilbara, because at that stage we were all scared of typhoons, cyclones, and all that sort of stuff, and this would take this stuff out at Geraldton. So I thought there was a good sort of economic geological reason to see whether there was decent iron ore deposits there. And I think probably only today somebody is now back there looking to see whether that is commercially practical. It didn't become commercially practical in my time with Reese and Northern Mining in that manifestation.
But I think that's why in the book it portrays it really well, is that this is where you've earned the title of the father of the discovery of Argyle Diamond Mine, because as we all know, it's team, but there has to be someone who's taking the heat and pushing and driving and coming up with the plausible explanations and possibilities, and that was you in that drive.
No, indeed.
You took the heat too, right? You didn't take all the glory only, but you took a lot of heat. How was that? Because that journey was as I said, it was a long journey. You had a lot of waits and ifs and buts and critical point before CRA came. I think at that point you probably was a big hurdle where you could have gone either way.
I am sure. As I say, but for M109, I'd lost all my credibility in London. You know, they'd said all my investments were no good. It's time you came back, or time you settled back in your homeland, and we cut the Gordian knot, so to speak.
Yep.
But I was determined, I suppose I'd have to say, to make something out of this diamond activity. Does that make sense? It was. I can see myself in this house sort of wondering how on earth I was going to convince people in these 5 very different parties, although they were mainly able to finance it, but they weren't going to throw their money down the drain. And finally we got to this Smoke Creek, but by now we'd changed our numbers. People had left, people had sold on and sold out. And by the time we got to Argyle, I think Sebeka was still there, but they didn't believe that it was going to be any good anyway, you know. So I was always fighting with the people that had started with me to keep the team together. And that's how Alan Jones and I, with Malaysian money, and myself with Tanganyika with lots of money, but no commitment to Ewen Tyler. I mean, I was in many ways betrayed, I thought, by my friends in the London office that swore that they would look after my interests, because I was a director of many of the company's activities in London at this stage, and they were all going to look after me. But when it came to shove, they weren't there. They were busy doing some other activity in North Sea oil, and they thought diamonds in Australia was a pretty stupid thing for us to be doing when we could make all this fortune in North Sea oil. Anyway, we got to Argyle. We got to Smoke Creek. We had to wait until the tenement was free, and then Warren Atkinson and Frank Hughes wandered up Smoke Creek. They got to where the Devonian conglomerate, which was where he initially thought the diamonds would probably be washed out of. They got past that, got through, walked up into this depression. There they saw an anthill with a diamond sticking out of it, and that was AK1. That was the Argyle pipe. And very quickly we discovered that it was also in Aboriginal territory. It was a woman's site, Argyle. So we had to take cognizance of that, had to start negotiating, not with the women, I might say, but with John Toby. And that's all very well laid out in the book, all that argy-bargy that went on. But really, before we got stuck into that and that program, we had to drill with 8-inch drill cores right the way through the Argyle eruptive. And we were amazed, particularly at the south end, as to how many diamonds came out of a ton of rock. It was not just carats per 100 tons, it was carats per ton.
So was this the holy grail to you?
This was the holy grail. This was walking up there. I didn't go there in October when we pegged it. I went up there in December, and it was just incredible to see that this big depression was a kimberlite pipe as far as I was concerned. And every time we put a drill hole down, particularly at the south end, it was not just carats per ton, it was tens of carats per ton. And so we knew that we got onto something. But of course, when we had the diamonds looked at, they weren't terribly crash hot.
In value.
In value,
yeah.
Yes, indeed.
But even at that time, carats per ton was an anomalous number in the world of diamonds.
It was 60 carats per ton.
So that would have been like once never seen before.
Never seen before. But the diamonds were only worth $6.30 per carat.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it was enough to make us feel we were onto something great. And of course, there was an outwash from these pipes into 2 creeks, into Smoke Creek and into Limestone Creek, which drained off. And we sampled in those, And of course, there were diamond mines in themselves, in their own right, in the concentrations of diamond. And then, instead of being $6 a carat, they were something like $20 a carat, because all the crud had been washed out of them. And so that's where the story of the pink diamond comes from, because out of the alluvial diamonds draining out of Smoke Creek, there was a pink diamond that my friend who lives up the street here, Bill Leslie, who was Ashton's solicitor at that stage, he got it on a visit when Nicky Oppenheimer was out in Australia. We were negotiating the diamond selling agreement with the De Beers people. He took it to London, had it cut and polished for Bill, and Bill gave it to his wife, Valerie. Yeah, I think his first wife, anyway.
So do you think that if there were no pinks, Argyle wouldn't have happened?
No. Argyle pinks were absolutely irrelevant to Argyle. There was no thought of pink production. Pink was a marketing thing. It was just the same as the champagne and cognac. Those were marketing devices we used to raise the value of our rough above the sort of very depressed price. And that was all due to the Queen's goldsmith, whose name, it'll come to me in a moment. He said that I think you should call these diamonds from Argyle champagne and cognac. And he made a most wonderful exhibition of diamond product. We showed it in Perth. I don't know whether you even saw it, but it was a polished diamond.
Too low down the ladder to see anything.
All sorts of, well, it was publicly exhibited, really. Eggs and performing eggs and, I don't know, all sorts of jewellery, all made of Argyle diamonds, cognac and champagne.
So
that was a marketing stunt. And of course, later on, we discovered that when we were getting a lot of pink, well, not a lot of pink, not 8 carats, when we were getting those, that was another marketing stunt to create something that was so unique. As far as we were concerned, it wasn't true. I mean, every diamond mine has a few pinks in it. You know, it's common. I mean, at Argyle we had every colour of the rainbow, in fact, but the pinks were the thing that we very early encountered, and we polished some of it, and it really did look beautiful. And that was, but it was not part of the economic study. The economic study, well, that's the next thing we should talk about, is how we'd now discovered that we'd got this thing, lots of diamonds. We thought we needed to produce 25 million carats a year in order to justify the investment. And now, could the market take 25 million carats of this stuff that we had? So we employed the Boston Consulting Group. They came in and did a very, very big marketing study to tell us whether they thought that we could sell 25 million carats into a world of that stage was probably producing 100 million carats a year, or perhaps less, of natural diamonds. So 25 million of another quarter of the world's production was quite a challenge, but they came up with a formula and they convinced us. And then, of course, having convinced us that there might be a possibility of doing, we obviously needed some money to make it happen. And so that comes down to the next story of the encounter with the bankers for Argyle. And now by now we were effectively two parties. There was CRA and there was Ashton Mining. After Ashton and Northern Mining, actually, with a 5% interest. But now we'd all got to go about the business of financing this project, you know. We wanted 350 million, we thought maybe 400 million, 350 million Australian dollars to set this thing up. Well, so we...
By the way, that's a big number in those days.
It was a very, very big number.
And also, no one had financed a diamond mine in debt the way you guys did. And also a lot of the people you talk to had never
seen
a diamond and also understood how valuation of a diamond mine is.
Indeed.
Because it's not your typical gold and nickel mine.
No, indeed. It was a very unique financing, never undertaken before in the world, apart from, Russia the Russian government financed it. De Beers financed most of the diamond, all the diamond production really, apart from small worker production in the likes of, in Borneo, in Kalimantan, that sort of thing. But this was of absolute first, with no experience, and Ashton, of course, had no experience. We've now got an estimate of 350, 400 million perhaps. Where are we going to get our 45% share? I mean, we were now about 45, 55 Rio Tinto or CRA, 45 Ashton, Ashton backed by Malaysian Mining Corporation, and they were very supportive, but, Mahathir didn't really like Australia, and there were complications in that arena. But nevertheless, obviously had to do our own financing. Ashton called for tenders who would like to help raise this money, and the tender box closed at 5 o'clock one afternoon. Alan went and looked in the box, and there was nothing in it. So no one had taken any interest in all this talking about diamond financing. But about half an hour later, he ran in with a piece of paper with Chase Manhattan would take a responsibility, but it was handwritten, signed by Andy Berry III. And Alan showed it to Les Froggatt, Sir Leslie Froggatt, our chairman. And he said, "Well, I'm not going to do anything until I get it on proper letterhead and properly signed." So Andy Berry was sent away, but nevertheless we had got one, and we signed him up. And Andy then took responsibility for the financing, or for arranging the financing. And of course that's another story in itself. And that's where he produced Bill Mulligan, and Bill Mulligan played a geologist for Chase Manhattan, and Bill Mulligan played a very important part, because Andy had got, first of all, be trying to sell not the message to other banks, but to try and see whether Chase Manhattan were going to put a dollar into this business. And I can see Andy Berry, Bill Mulligan and I around the pool in the Parmelia Hotel, me talking geology to Mulligan, and I was saying, "Well, there's mountains, this is something out of this world." And so when Mulligan was being interrogated by their financing people in London and in Hong Kong, I think, and the chap said, "Are there any diamonds there?" And Mulligan said, "There's shitloads of diamonds at Argyle." They again agreed to put in 25 million. Chase Manhattan gave their first contribution. Then Andy and Bill had to roadshow for the rest of what was our share, is 175 million.
175 million.
Yeah.
And this book does detail that really well, and I think, but this kind of highlights the significance of this discovery of Argyle and getting the Argyle Diamond Mine up, is that not only was it the first and biggest diamond mine in the world, and still is in terms of carats and things like that, but it was also the first time this had been funded by debt. It's the first time Ashton had found, first in Australia, and it almost passed in significance with the discovery of Olympic Dam, except now that we're understanding the hard part was not just, and it was hard, the technical to find it, but the actual financing as well. And one thing you haven't really touched on and is the discussion with First Nations and everything else, and how that's kind of pear-shaped in some ways at the end, in some ways.
Oh.
Would you like to comment on that?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, that I was not so involved in that, I must say. That was largely a business done with the CRA people, but it was a case of swinging John Toby into seeing that this was all right for his people, and that the good neighbour policy that we offered was an acceptable thing. We were prepared to place, I think it was $25 million. It's a bit long time ago now. We were prepared to make capital investments in various activities. I can remember there was a primary school established on Glen Hill Station, which is really where the Argyle pipe was, because it was on Aboriginal land. I mean, all that country was Aboriginal land. But we managed to convince John Toby, and he managed to talk to his people. And sometimes they liked him and sometimes they hated him. But nevertheless, one way or another, we got him down to Perth and signed the Good Neighbour Agreement. And that was a real door opener, because without that, we would not been able to even contemplate bringing this thing or spending any more money on it. I mean, in all this time we were spending money. Before we actually started to think about production, we'd spent $125 million in the exploration phase. So it was a very, very significant time that Frank Hughes and the rest of that team spent talking to these Aborigine chaps. And I believe at the end of the day, it was a good deal for them. I have never had, and I mean, we saw, or I saw, Mick saw, that this would be a real money spinner for the Aborigine community up in the vicinity of Kununurra and Argyle. And I mean, in the end of the day, I think 10% of the workforce were Aborigine chaps. And I'll never forget actually looking and seeing a very large and complicated rotary particle sorting machine, and seeing a pair of black feet sticking out underneath and somebody working underneath, dealing with all this electronics. He was one of the Aborigines. We had the Aborigine Apprentice of the Year for a number of years, came from Argyle. We had trained, worked very wonderfully, I believe, with these chaps. I like them enormously, actually.
I mean, that process, I mean, we've talked extensively and we've sort of elaborated how difficult it is, but I think it's the magnitude small, because there's discussion early on to sign with the CSO, getting the right price, and that also was part of the reason why you got the funding or not the funding. They looked at that, and then you moved away from the CSO while you're making to market. What I actually will be interesting for a lot of people, because as you pointed out, the pings, the champagnes, the cognacs were all marketing ploy. At which point in time did that come in? I didn't quite get it in the book, but was it the reason why you guys left, or was it after you left or before you left where this idea came up?
We knew that we would not be able to finance Argyle without De Beers. That was, some of us, I mean, we had to argue this with the Australian government, and I mean, Malcolm Fraser was so dead against anybody doing business with a South African company. Problem number one. The leader of the Country Party, Doug Anthony, was not so difficult about that. Alan Jones and I went to see that to make sure that the federal government was not going to stop us exporting the diamonds. So that was another hurdle. If we did business with De Beers, what would happen? The federal government took a view, we will leave it to Charles Court to decide on whether this marketing arrangement is good or not. So we had to really go into discussion with Harry Oppenheimer And he did it, bless him, he did it personally to talk about how we could get some sort of compromise arrangement between what De Beers would require and what we would require to placate our government, and how that interface would work. So we had to find out, what sort of proposition could we put to De Beers, and De Beers wanted to have all the diamonds. That was their starting position. Anyway, eventually, and you must remember, and maybe I've not told you, our production, our size distribution, the quality distribution was we had 5% gemstones, 45% what we call Indian goods that could be cut and polished in India, became very important in the end, and 55% industrial goods. So that was no, we've got 5% too many, I think.
I think 55, 40,
45
yeah.
and 50, that's
Yeah.
right. So that's what we've got. De Beers wanted all. They wanted the Indian goods. They thought they would like the Indian goods as well, and nobody was terribly fussed about the industrial stuff. So anyway, in the end, no, I've got to get this right. I've forgotten. De Beers did get all the gem, with the exception of what we needed to cut and polish in West Australia, because we had been obliged to build a cut and polishing plant as part of our negotiated, and that's another story, negotiating the...
That was a blessing in disguise, I think, at the end. Yeah.
Negotiating the state agreement was another facet of the whole story, another hurdle that had to be crossed. We got what we thought was a fair deal for the purposes of convincing the Australian government that we hadn't sold everything to De Beers. We know the Indian goods, and I'm very proud of the fact that 1 million Indians were cut and polishing Argyle Indian goods. It was really a supply of keeping other people on the planet working to deal with this enormous production. I worry now what is happening to them now that Argyle is closed. Maybe they built up a big stock of them, I don't know. But that's my humanity, my sort of, like I was worried about the Aborigines, and I knew we were going to create work. As I say, I found this chap, Aborigine chap, absolutely highly trained in electronics, and we had the Aboriginal, I've said this, or the Aboriginal Apprentice of the Year.
I think at the end of the day, you at that time, it just happens. I always say that, looking back for yourself, obviously, you retrospectively, you say, oh, could have done this, could have done that, but at that point, it is what it is, I guess, in some ways. It kind of, and the magnitude of getting Argyle up, I never thought it was that big. and after reading the book and now talking to you, and we talked a bit before we went on recording,
Yeah.
It's actually much larger than I felt. It's and I'm pretty sure Olympic Dam would have been similar, because they had low copper pricing, then they had the uranium issues.
Right down, deep down.
Yeah.
It wasn't as though it was on the top, it was right down.
And this is where, I guess now, it's probably a good time. I mean, investors out there in the world, one of the first thing I noticed was that you were involved on the corporate side of things very early in your career, in your life. And
when I went to London.
Yeah, and you went to London.
After Africa.
And in those days, you kind of sort of lived in that world. And in today, I find that, a lot of people measure success of and in what we do, we have a lot of public companies talking. The investors almost measure success in one drilling program. And as we know, there are many, many bad drilling programs, or not so good drilling programs.
Not so good drilling program.
But that's the name of the game, right?
That is the name of the game.
And we spoke of air before about how many things you did that didn't quite work out. You know,
Why they nearly sacked me.
yeah, and that's the kind of thing. And that's the journey of diamond exploration is in its tier of its own. You know, you said only fools do this.
Only fools go looking for diamonds.
And I only had a small taste of this, and I completely agree with you. I had a short stint, a few years working in the diamond industry, but I loved it. I loved the chase, the discovery. But we couldn't do it today, could we? I mean,
Well, I'm keeping my fingers crossed. There's another kimberlite field, 700 kilometres south of Argyle, 300 pipes. Talk to Tom.
yes,
Diamonds on the surface.
the Webb diamond field.
CGC Resources, I think they call themselves now, used to be Geocrystal. Tom and I did some drilling there. We've drilled, I think, only 50 pipes, but they're kimberlitic, there's no question about that. And there are diamonds on the surface, micro diamonds, but there's real significant untravelled. They don't look as though they're diamonds, they look as though they're pristine. They've come out of a sediment that sits over the pipes, but there's something else in there that someday someone may decide to do something about it.
That was my next question was, you know, in obviously, where could we find the next Argyle? I mean, we've had Merlin. Merlin was another one.
Merlin is still there to be waiting to be done.
And I'm pretty sure, you know, you've had a few dikes and stuff all over the Kimberleys. There's dikes in the territory that diamond bearing, just not economical.
No, indeed. World's biggest micro diamond mine.
Well, that was Coenjula. People are looking in South Australia.
Yeah.
Then there's Copton and Bingara that really hasn't been solved in some ways.
All mysteries.
Mysteries. And I agree. Webb has compelling evidence, compelling story.
That's right.
Tom has been on Coffee with Samso talking about it.
Yeah.
And I think I'm with you. I'm convinced that's if you're ever going to find a diamond-bearing kimberlite pipe or a fuel, that's as good a place as you're going to go.
That's a good place to start.
Yeah.
But I think these chaps are more interested in rare earths, copper, nickel, cobalt. You know, the people at CGC, I think they call themselves.
Yeah.
So there are diamonds in those diamond pipes. There has to be because they're on the surface.
So, do you think there's another Argyle somewhere in Australia or somewhere out there? Because we're talking about
I'm sure there has to be.
The size of Argyle, do you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
As eruptives go, it's not that big. It's only, what was it, 45 hectares? Or was it acres?
Correct.
45. No.
Um,
I would really love to go to India and try and find where all those very big ghoulies come from.
Okay. Because, yeah, they have
there's got to be a source there.
Yep.
You know, somewhere in that.
So one of my jobs when I was...
Did you do India with Ashton?
No, but one of my jobs was to compile all the occurrences of diamonds in the world. And yes, they're there, but I wasn't part of the team. But as I said, you know, I was at Merlin. But to round everything up, you know, looking back at your journey, you know, let's have Ewen Tyler's words of wisdom on mineral exploration. How do you see it? And what's your thoughts and advice for guys out there who are in the game?
It's the most exciting business in which you can ever be engaged, in my view. You have to accept success with failure. You know, they go, but sometimes you're going to strike the lucky chord and you're going to be successful. But there's no formula for success. I believe you make your own luck. That's what an expression I use. But I believe the business is about people. That's what I always used to tell my team. And how management is set up to run any activity It starts from the top and it works right the way through. And in my view, people like Maury Morby, who knew the name of every miner underground in the mines at Broken Hill, that is what leads to success. And that's the message I like to think that I leave with everyone. If you're going to think you're the boss and you're going to have great ideas of your own importance, it's time that you forgot that and realised that the bloke actually at the coalface is just as important. And it's your business, if you're a good boss, to know when his child has got measles or it's got whooping cough. Because I think that's what makes teamwork worthwhile.
Well, I fully agree that, because I always tell people the guy collecting the samples, if not the most important person, because if he does make a mistake, everything hinges on that point, right?
And that was what happened when, of course, when CRA first joined the we created the Ashton joint venture. Of course, they just thought you just went up and collected bags of sand and send them to the lab. And so the first year they were part doing some sampling work. It was a complete waste of time. Nobody had bothered to instruct the chaps at the bottom that it was necessary to get down to the bedrock. You had to get down and really scrape up what was sitting there right on the bedrock. It's no good collecting sand from the creek. You've got to dig down with your trenching tool, get down there and pull up a proper sample. And that was what Maureen was very good at. Maureen found M109 and Maureen found the diamonds in Smoke Creek. Now, whether it was her sampling or the rest of us were no good, I don't know, but Maureen certainly had it as a sampler, collecting it, and God bless her soul, she died collecting a diamond sample.
This is Maureen Muggeridge.
Muggeridge, yeah.
And words of wisdom from Ewen Tyler, is there, should this be is there ever an impossible exploration discovery, or is there, should I rephrase that and say, there is never an impossible exploration discovery?
I'm sure there's always a discovery possible. You know, I mean, I'm still desperate to find a platinum deposit in Australia. And I believe that when Rob Mosick and I were working with Helix Resources, we discovered one up in the Pilbara. Now, it was a platinum, it was a palladium platinum ratio, which was wrong for 1990 or whenever we were doing it. But now there is a resource there that is now palladium over platinum that I would think would be worth somebody seriously doing it. And I believe there is a company that has those tenements.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm not sure who they are, and I'm not sure what they're doing. But I mean, when we drilled them, there was enough drilling, I thought, to indicate that there was something there. But of course, it was the wrong way round. Palladium was not as valuable as platinum. But today, that equation has changed. Now, palladium is twice the value of platinum. And so that, I would think, that drilling that we did, if it was reviewed properly, could make something that was impossible possible. I think that was your question.
Yeah, yep. Fantastic way to finish.
Good.
And I'll conclude by, Florence Drummond, who's a fellow director on my company, and she's helped us from the start, provided this coffee for you, and it's a coffee we give away to all victims of Samso. But suffice to say,
I haven't made you a cup of coffee. I'm very much aware of that. We can have a cup after.
Yep, not a problem. But suffice to say that it has been a fantastic conversation. We have a lot of common things that I shared with you when we first started. It's the fact that you were in Kuching, Sarawak, where I was born. My grandfather had a gold mine in Bau, which you've visited many times. You found your first diamond in Sarawak.
Up there.
You worked with Rex Prado, who's Professor Prado, who cannot be by foster father to my father, who my dad called Pops whenever he saw him,
yes.
and Mum, Mrs. Prada.
He played the piano.
Yeah, and you work closely with them, and Diamond, and I'm a tragic Diamond fan. But Ewen, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Noel, very much for taking your time to come and hear this story of mine.
Yes, it's a fantastic one, and hopefully we can do a part 2 when I process everything and
Well,
I realise.
I'll have to find the life support one.
Look, for 95 year, your memory is fantastic.
I forgot a few things,
But yeah, no, it's the whole purpose is documenting these kind of things, and I think I have great pleasure in coming here, and I look forward to it, and I just hope my editing skills will be up to scratch and get this out there. But thank you, and I hope everyone who watched this would appreciate the struggles and the effort and time that the likes of yourself and the team. Don't forget that it's a team game.
It's a team game.
And the Discovery Argyle, and
Somebody has to lead the team, and that's all.
Yep, and somebody had to be in the team, and without the team, there would not be a father of the Argyle Diamond Mine. So,
Nor would there be a grandfather.
no, the grandfather.
Rex was most insistent.
Well, thank you, and let's hope we can have another conversation again.